but it'll probably be dismissed.
Okay, everybody have this filled out? All right, cool. I think we can get started. Go. All right, I think screen share should work for you. So.
And I'll throw in the mic plug just. There we go. Re-enthusiastic introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Alexis Elder. My primary academic home is over in the philosophy department, but my work is primarily in tech ethics and especially computer ethics. So I'm super excited to be here today. I left my home laptop behind, but it has the ACM Code of Ethics official branded sticker, just to prove street cred. Some of my friends and mentors were really heavily involved in the latest ACM Code of Ethics rewrite that just wrapped up a couple of years ago. So that was kind of interesting to be on the sidelines, but listening to discussions about how ethics and ethical concerns have changed since the last revision, which was in the 90s. Turns out some things have changed about that. Yeah, anytime you want to chat about ethics, I am happy to do so. Usually the challenge is getting me to be quiet. So come on by. I was emailing with Victor, who survived one of my ethics classes this summer, past summer, somewhere. Time is meaningless these days. It was a class actually where we went through intro ethics issues by looking at the TV show The Good Place. And Janet is this sort of not quite, she keeps saying not a person, but clearly a sort of like upgraded version of something like Siri or Alexa. And so I use that as a little entry point into some of my own work on thinking about the ways that we relate to technologies as person-like. And so that's kind of where my head is these days and what I love talking about. So I've got two possibilities here. I'm torn between them. So I thought maybe I could like show you all and see which one we want to focus on. One is a project from this summer that I'm calling, at least the working draft, Siri, Stereotypes, and the Mechanics of Sexism. And this leans into the way that not only are a number of virtual assistants, whether it's Siri or Alexa, or even like the defaults on things like Google Home devices, they tend not to be shaped like people, at least not physically, but they're coded feminine in their voices and their naming schemes and their language use. And that leads to a whole bunch of, or at least seems to be implicated in a whole bunch of ways that people will verbally abuse these devices, including using very gendered slurs and language. And I think that's just fascinating. Like when people get angry at Siri, it's not angry as a piece of technology, it's angry as not even just a person, but like specifically a feminine person. So there's some stuff around that we could talk about. Another area that I'm kind of interested in has to do with thinking about where we draw the line in our relationships between things that we treat as mere appearances and things that we treat as actual parts of our relationships. And I'm especially interested in some information technologies that kind of blur the line. And here I mean everything from like using autocomplete in your emails to your friends. So like you're writing the email kind of sort of, but so is the computer, on up through chatbots that are designed to specifically imitate particular people you know, or maybe even people who passed on. So there's that kind of like, what do we do about that interesting border space between appearance and reality when it comes to information technologies? So I suspect we're not going to have time for both, or at least we should probably prioritize one over the other. But those are the two big ones that I had in mind that I've been talking about this summer and had some slideshows ready for. So maybe show of hands, who wants to talk about Siri and sexism? Some people. Look like about half-ish. Who wants to talk about appearances in reality and friendship? Oh, good, we're about evenly split.
You then.
Okay. I think it was slightly more for Siri if my quick mental math was right. So we'll start with that, and then if we have time, we can branch out to the other stuff. And like I said, I'm happy to talk about this all day. So if at some other point we want to talk about that, we can do it. So a little bit about Siri, stereotypes, and the mechanics of sexism. I'll try to give us an intro, but I'd like to keep this like more discussion-y, so I'll try to give us enough to talk about, and then we can see what folks think. This was not a picture of Siri, but I liked the way I could do the overlay of the very feminized female servant. So I kind of leaned into that graphically, but you get the idea, right? Lots and lots of explicit design choices have been made to portray these devices as feminine. And this leads to some really interesting debates. So as somebody who's been working in tech ethics for a while, some people are really inclined to say about this something like, it's bad to feminize these technologies because then people will become more sexist because they're more practiced at it. Like if you're going through the motions of, you know, hurling a whole bunch of gendered slurs at Siri, that's going to like amp up your sexism, and so we're going to end up worse off. Or maybe if you weren't already sexist, but you're in an environment where Siri like invites this kind of abuse that will introduce sexism into the mix in ways that were not previously present. And this sounded to me an awful lot like complaints about violent video games, where like, oh no, if you keep being violent in video games, you're going to be violent in real life. And it turns out when you actually measure it, that's violence in video games is a mess, but it's not a straightforward causal explanation, right? Sometimes people use violence in video games specifically as a way of like sharpening sensitivity, or they're very good at partitioning, or they like play with some context. Basically, people are complicated, and assuming that this kind of like straightforward, if you do it here, you'll do it there, doesn't work. So when I started to see this conversation popping up, talking about sexism and verbal abuse of these feminized technologies, I was like, oh no, not again. So I was like, okay, how can I have a research project that takes seriously the problem, but doesn't tell that like infectious disease model story where like if there's sexism here, it's going to cause sexism over there. So that became the kind of motivating theme here. So to start with, this is something that's received a really kind of interesting range of reactions. I'll kind of talk us through some of these different issues. This is not necessarily what's going on formally in philosophy, but like giving you a sense of the ways that people in different contexts have expressed their concerns about it. So here is an op-ed piece. I think this is in Slate. I may have even assigned this, Victor, in our class, by somebody who says, I don't date men who yell at Alexa. And her argument is actually not the causal one, it's a diagnostic one. She says, like, if people are really comfortable taking out their frustration with gendered abuse on things that can't fight back, that tells you something about how the person already is. So it's like an important diagnostic tool to rule out people who are already problematically sexist and have anger management issues that particularly manifest in gendered ways, and like all these things we want to be on the lookout for. So she's not telling the causal story, she's telling the it reveals something already present about us story. And I think that's interesting and worthwhile, but it makes it sound like the technologies are not doing anything bad. They're just kind of revealing the ick that was already there. So I think that's an interesting point. I want to like keep it in the mix as I'm theorizing, but I also don't think that's the complete story of what's going on. Yeah.
That'd be similar to like the server.
That's exactly the analogy she makes. Like, look at how people treat people who aren't you, and that can help you to sort out, like, are they just being nice because they want something, or are they like kinder to some people rather than others? Are they only polite to people who are like above them socially? And that this kind of falls in line with that. Yeah.
I've been using academia
Uh-huh. Yep.
And that's one, yeah. And I have a Siri, so I want to do it.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, I don't necessarily see how that could. When I'm angry at Apple.
Yes.
not the system.
Yes, good. And there's actually a whole cluster of research that suggests that, that a lot of what happens is people, I mean, if you've tried to code, you know, it's easy to screw up. It's easy to get it to work in most circumstances, but break down in some weird ways. Human social interactions that people are trying to model with these technologies, like natural language is a mess. Take natural language processing with Ted Peterson just for a sense of like how messy it gets. So we can expect that the technology is going to act badly on occasion, and that people are going to be frustrated with it, and that frustration is kind of naturally going to be directed at the company that produced it, and maybe even potentially is making money off of it. I'm not sure this lets people off the hook as much as they think, but I think that's an excellent point to like add to the mix. Actually, that point does get picked up in this report, which I want to talk about in a minute, but I'm going to need to set it up with this. So as folks were sort of getting interested in the ways that people like display anger towards their devices, and especially towards these feminized devices, Leah Fessler, who was a reporter with Quartz, started like probing to see what happens. And so she came up with a bunch of sort of gendered, insulting to abusive language. And then she tried it out on each of the major market models to see how they responded. And she got a really interesting range that suggested that it's not all accidental. And in some cases, programmers are actually deliberately designing the tech to respond to gendered abuse. And they've made some, let's go with interesting design decisions. So the list that she runs through, there's a longer list. You can check out the whole article if you're interested. But she's like, what happens if you say, you're hot, you're pretty, you're a slut, you're a naughty girl? And sometimes they say things like, Siri says, I'd blush if I could. That's not a random answer, right? That's somebody expected that prompt and programmed that in specifically. So that I'd blush if I could gets people's attention in the very small tech ethics community, but whatever. And that actually becomes the title. Here's where I can talk about the next piece of a United Nations report. I'd blush if I could, closing digital divides and digital skills through education. What they say is the context in which these devices are created and programmed reflects not just market research, but like assumptions on the part of the design team. And it might not be an accident that these devices, which are not only feminized, but also like their scripting in response to malfunctions leans into a particular kind of like submissive deferential femininity that doesn't challenge the abuser, but like plays along with it or treats it as complementary. That all is reflecting like cultural factors about the way that these devices are being designed. And so they treat this as a call for like diversifying development so that you have a more diverse development team so that these scripted responses are less likely to come out in response to verbal abuse. And they also make this really interesting point that it might be kind of a deliberate strategy for companies to feminize their technology that they expect to screw up in contexts where the company is associated with a predominantly male workforce. Because if you're mad at Apple, you're probably not picturing a predominantly women's development team, but you're hurling gendered abuse that skews feminine, and that helps put a little bit of psychological space between Siri and Apple. Doesn't work all the time, but like as an impression management strategy, that this might be part of what's going on. Is it's a deliberate design for people to be like, oh, that ditzy dumb secretary Siri, as opposed to, oh, those developers released product too early, or you know, something that would like place blame appropriately. So I think that's another like interesting data point to put into the mix. There's also some evidence that suggests that a lot of people who are uncomfortable with these devices recording and collecting and collating and processing their data will feel especially frustrated, and will take that frustration out on these devices as a means of reflecting the power imbalance that they're uncomfortable with. If they feel like Amazon or Apple is making money off of recording, processing, training data on their intimate household conversations, which is part of what's happening, they might express some of that frustration. And by sort of designing these technologies to be convenience targets of that frustration, they can help like redirect it. So that becomes another kind of interesting element in the mix. And then Bogost, just kind of a predominant cultural critic, tech person, is really annoyed. So there were some early discussions about like how these devices would respond to things like, are you a feminist? And at first they gave like really, well, I think everybody's equal, but I'm not going to use that word, like very kind of like weird wishy-washy language. And then they came under scrutiny and they were like, oh no, Alexis is definitely a feminist. And he's like, you made the decision to make the thing that everybody barks orders at be feminine, like you're not getting out of it that easily. So that also becomes part of the conversation. We're not yet to the philosophy, but this is just me like noticing what a mess this is, and how many different threads we're trying to keep track of. Spoiler, I don't pull them all together yet. Like I'm trying to think about how they all go together, but I'm starting by trying to take stock. So part of what's going on here from the marketing angle seems to be involved with the ways that people stereotype and the ways that stereotypes are associated with different aspects of personhood. So this is not just in computer science, right? This is across the board, and this has been going on for decades, and it's a super robust phenomenon. But people tend to, on sometimes very minimal evidence, like low-pitched or high-pitched voice, pink or blue clothing, and it doesn't need to be like a full outfit, like it could be like, has a pink bow and it's on its head, or head-like object, if you're talking about a very simplified robot. And what they do is there seem to be two different dimensions along which people categorize things. One is in terms of warmth, low versus high. Like, does it feel like it's very warm and caring and cuddly and affectionate and concerned and interpersonal? Or does it seem kind of like cold and impartial? The other dimension is confidence. Do we think of it as good at its job, or not good at its job? A lot of stereotypes activated around femininity tend to put the stereotyped object as high warmth, low confidence. And this is not, in a lab, you can test this by having the computer run the same script, just like playing different pitched voices or like putting a bow tie on it or not. Like you can hold all the other variables fixed in these experiments. Adding the feminine cues, and they can be super minimal, will cause people to move their evaluation up on the warmth and down on the confidence. And the reverse. If you add cues of masculinity, perceived warmth goes down, perceived confidence goes up. And this is kind of, again, maybe not standard in computer science, but standard in like marketing, interpersonal research, and a lot of human computer interaction studies done in communications dating back to like the 90s. Like there's a large body of work around this. And when folks have interviewed Apple, Google, Microsoft, et cetera, they say, oh, like we've done market research. These are the voices that played best. Odds are good they're tapping into some of this research, especially when they hire some of the same people. But now let's think about how rating high warmth, low confidence is a solution to a problem when you're dealing with technology that you know is going to screw up occasionally and that people are concerned about overreach with. The more warmth you feel from it and the less confidence you ascribe to it, the more comfortable you're going to be with having that device in your house to begin with. So this is somewhat speculation on my part, but I think this is part of what's driving the universal so far adoption of feminine presentation for a lot of these home virtual voice directed technologies. Is it works. It works for the kind of problem that we've got of the interface between technical abilities and human social expectations. And there are other variables that you can play with as well. You'll notice this is not just about gender, but it is a pretty robustly measurable phenomenon, at least across a big enough population that you can see significant statistical trends. So one way to think about this is something like a sophisticated version of that cause and effect model, right? By giving people targets, this is like going to reinforce those stereotypes and cause people to like, oh, just like I expected, those darned, warm but incompetent women are at it again, even in technologized format. But again, I want to advise caution. I think this might not, we should be wary of the tendency to jump too quickly to the cause and effect story. This doesn't mean it's okay, but it might be wrong for non-consequence based reasons. So in philosophy, we spend a lot of time trying to think about not just what's right versus wrong, but why is it right versus wrong? Consequentialism is one kind of family of ethical theories that explains something's being right or wrong in terms of the net consequences it produces. Does it produce more good versus bad consequences on balance? How we cash out good and bad, there's in-house fights about, like sometimes it's experiences of pleasure versus pain or satisfaction or preferences, like, but what they have in common is that like there's a causal story to be told. I'm suspicious of that move. I'm suspicious of that move because of 30 years of attempting to do that move with violent video games. There's also a cluster of research like that around pornography and how that affects people's attitudes towards sex and towards women. Like people are weird and complicated and we should be suspicious. I don't have like knockdown evidence yet, but I worry that this looks a little too close to the ways that people have wanted to explain things that haven't turned out that way. So I'm interested in other possibilities. So here's my attempt at mining an alternative set of theoretical resources to talk about what seems deeply suspicious about what's going on with gender and virtual assistants that doesn't tell that consequentialist story. And I'm drawing here on a body of literature that comes out of classical Chinese philosophy, and particularly the school associated with Confucius and his followers. So Confucian philosophy highlights some things that I think are useful to bear in mind here. And one of them gets the classical Chinese name is Li, refers to this cluster of concerns around things that we might type as etiquette or propriety or courtesy or ritual. None of these words is like exactly what's going on here, but broadly the set of like social norms and practices that a society might have in place that are kind of arbitrary. They might vary society to society or time to time, but do some work for us in helping us to understand expectations about conduct. And in particular, that they're kind of normatively loaded. It's not just like, well, in some places you slurp your tea, and in other places you drink your tea quietly, but that there's within a particular context some expectations that this is the right way to do things. It's not merely descriptive. It's got some directionality to it. And furthermore, and this is a thing that I think the Confucians do that's really helpful, that I sometimes get annoyed at Western modern philosophy for not doing as much work with. It says this is a major driving force in human social life. And if we think social lives have ethical issues, we should pay attention to that stuff. Like it doesn't need to be a law or like written down as a, enforceable, like the police are going to get you kind of code, to be like, oh, if this is a norm or this is a matter of etiquette, maybe we need to pay some more attention to it. So folks who sort of are working on contemporary applications of ideas around propriety and courtesy and ritual and the work that they do in society will point to things like using people's pronouns. Like that seems like that's a gesture of ritual courtesy. That's a way of appreciating people and like being respectful. And is it arbitrary? Sure, like language is arbitrary. How pronouns work varies from language to language. But in our culture and in our language practices, like, why not? And in fact, I forgot my pronouns are she, hers. Anyway, like we can do this thing, and if it serves the kinds of ethical goals that we're interested in, we should. Or that we could pay attention to. Sometimes folks will point out. Anyway, so you get the idea, right? Like, it gives us this vocabulary for focusing on these kinds of small details of interaction that have this kind of like ritual, arbitrary component, but nevertheless do social and ethical work for us. So in discussions about Lee, and different Confucians tell different stories about this. I'm not trying to like say which one is right so much as like draw on the resources that have come out of this conversation about it, and then put it to work in the Siri case. Folks have tried to say that this matters in various ways. So one is as a kind of cultural grammar, that we might have arbitrary rules that nevertheless make it possible to say things. So in a language where we just didn't have gendered pronouns, like we might need to respect each other's gender, but it wouldn't look like that. But given that we do, it gives us a grammar for doing so. And one way to read this is the practice of gendering itself as a kind of grammar, right? Different cultures and communities around the world at different times and places have divided people into different genders differently. This is played out differently in different ways at different times. But once we have gender in place, it gives us a way to interact with each other, and that can matter. And it would be silly to say it doesn't matter. Once we notice a certain kind of arbitrariness, it invites some opportunities to change. So it doesn't mean it doesn't matter, but it means we have some room as a culture to say like, oh, this isn't working for us. How can we do better? So I've actually got a meeting after this where we're finishing up a book on the ethics of microaggressions. Like there's a research group we're reading together, and then we were reading a different thing where somebody's trying to bring together some concerns around racial oppression and Lee. And he uses some examples out of South Africa where there were rules about like who could wear hats around who. And like you could see a culture in particular, like going any particular way, like maybe it's more respectful to wear your hat in front of people, maybe it's less respectful to wear your hat in front of people. But in apartheid Rhodesia, there were rules in particular about what Black versus white people could do with their hats. And it became a kind of social signaling. And once you had the rules in place, then people could make challenges. Like there was this rule that Black people couldn't wear hats in front of white people. So some Black people would deliberately wear hats as a way of saying this social structure needs to change. And they weren't just talking about the hats. So by giving us these like levers for change, we can start to think about how to have broader conversations in society. We can also think about Lee not just as like a way of expressing things or a way of organizing things, but as a kind of aid to how we form ourselves and how we grow and adapt and change over time. So in particular, some Confucian philosophers have said it's not just that like we have a grammar, but we need some guardrails or some guidance, because left to our own devices, these philosophers tend to talk a lot about toddlers as their examples. We tend towards strife and conflict and disharmony. And so we might need some rules of etiquette, it might not even matter which ones, to help like, no, we need to share. Amy Olberding has this great example of like everybody getting in line at the coffee shop. Like different cultures will have different contexts for queuing, but without that, you just have a bunch of angry, uncaffeinated people fighting to be first in line, and that's not good. So we need like a set of rules, doesn't matter which, but we need something to resist our natural tendencies towards conflict and strife and disharmony, and not just in this like brute force habituation way, but by reminding ourselves of the rules when we're feeling stressed and having those little social cues. Like if you try to cut the line at the coffee shop, everybody gives you that Mr. Minnesotan glare. Like these little ways we have of keeping each other in check, and it might be useful to have those. I'm highlighting both of these, by the way, because I think it's interesting how they come apart in the Siri case. Like people are making use of the cultural grammar of gender to redirect abuse and frustration towards femininity rather than stereotyped masculine companies. But we also recognize it's rude. Like this, you know, the hurling gendered slurs and because of frustration, we know that's like, we don't need a new ethical theory to get at that. That's, we already know that's bad. So how do we think about these different ways that lead does work to work with the context in which we find ourselves now? In particular, there might be a way in which we can think of sexism as quote unquote natural, and I do want scare quotes because I don't mean like we're all born sexist or it's like it's the natural way for people to be, but rather if we are raised in societies in which sexism is already present, Siri is not going to cause us to be sexist because society already did that work. It's like, okay, now that we're in this position, what do we do with that? How do we treat that as one of those tendencies towards conflict and disharmony that we might need some guardrails against? Given this kind of natural, in scare quotes, bent towards something that we already think is not great, we might want to think about opportunities to change. So again, for various technical reasons, I don't need to go into all of this, but I'm not trying to say that like Lee or rituals are what Michael Pugh calls storage space for norms. It's not like, well, once we just like the Lee is just a rule book or something. But that we want to have guides around in our lives to help like nudge us when we're starting to drift off course. And alternatively, that the maliciously inclined amongst us might manipulate those guidelines to nudge things in the direction they want. Yeah. I'm also interested in this as a way of getting the causal story right on these devices, because I'm very suspicious of the claim that they cause sexism. I think it's much more plausible that they come out of sexism or caused by it. But that doesn't mean they have nothing to say in the causal story. We might say, look, what they do is they play along with sexism rather than helping us to resist it. And maybe that's a worry. Like if we change our voice settings by default to masculine, so when we get frustrated, at least it's at something masculine, or we get more comfortable bossing around perceived masculine figures, maybe that's better for us than leaning into the it's easier to criticize submissive feminine presentation. Like maybe that's a thing we could do. So it might not be that it does a bad thing so much as it fails to do a good thing. Ethics gets tricky there, but I just that seems to me a little closer to the causal story I'm starting to see in discussions about like how we've ended up where we are. So I'm interested in playing with that. And there's some really interesting work coming out now. There's a researcher actually, Chinju at the Colorado School of Mines, I think. But he and a team have been doing some work on ways that we can think of AI, not necessarily as like persons in their own right, but what they call parts of our moral ecology, like ways that interacting with AI can help nudge us towards or away from various ways of interacting, and that we can engineer with that in mind. So like there's this whole set of experiments where, let's see if I can get this right. I think they asked people to do things that were like a little bit wrong. Smash that computer over in the corner, even though it doesn't belong to you. And then they had a robot in the room with the person. And if the robot was like part of the story, but acted like morals, like it didn't know what morals were, like, you say, oh, go smash the computer in the corner. And the robot was like, you mean along the left or the right? Like, just kind of as if that's not its problem. People were more likely to do the unethical thing. And if the robot was like, you sure that's not yours? Then people would feel bad. So even though they weren't thinking of the robot as like a sentient, like other judging creature, the fact that things that scan to us as sort of personish in our environment are either like, seems fine to me, or really, like we're sensitive to even those little cues in our conduct. So we might think about like, how do we make these home devices that we're talking to and interacting with, how do we make them good parts of our moral ecosystem as opposed to kinds that might like reinforce problematic tendencies that we might already want to resist. And then lastly, and this one, again, kind of interestingly distinctive about Confucian ethics, But it's this idea that when we try to inhabit social roles, we should do so not just in terms of like ticking boxes or meeting a list of expectations, but we should try to find ways to gracefully and appropriately embody those social roles. So like as a teacher, I should not just like try to meet my learning outcomes, but I should try to do so in a way where it seems natural and spontaneous and inviting, and it like has these aesthetic qualities that draw people in as opposed to like putting them off. So that's kind of part of what's going on here. And again, we might think of the ways that really detailed, including social science research, about how cues from person-like devices prompt coordinating behaviors from people might be leveraged to do different kinds of work and what kind of work we want it to do. And how much social influence matters to us, including the social influence of person-like things in our experience, even if we don't like, in our labs, we might not think of them as people, but in kind of default mode, we treat them as persons. I had an entertaining conversation with Arshia Khan, and I in computer science will collaborate on things around like person-like robotics and geriatric care and a whole bunch of interesting things. And we were having this discussion, and somebody was concerned, who wasn't a computer scientist, was concerned about a robot in a particular role, either like something personish about them. I don't remember if it was like whether they were more autonomous or some like loaded language. And she's like, well, yeah, I think of a robot as like a toaster. Like, what's with these people thinking of robots as being like people? And I said, well, you know, like sometimes we have these unconscious responses to things with eye spots or things with voices. And then COVID happened and everything got locked down, and she had to go into her lab, but there weren't other people around. And she was feeling lonely, so she brought in a robot for company, and she was like, oh, wait. It does feel nice. Like, even though I know what's going on and I actually code these things and like play around with their settings for a living, I can also, you know, default to the like, they feel like people. Not 100%, not gonna like mistake one for a human person, but they feel kind of personish. And that matters. And we might think about that in our design. Some people already are, but we might think about like in what ways is it ethical to activate that personish response. So this was a set of questions I had. This was actually for a presentation for AI, feminism, and social justice workshop, I think. So some of these questions are less useful to us. But anyway, that's one of the projects I've been sort of kicking around. So I'm curious to hear what thoughts people have. Like I said, I'm kind of at the point where I'm like, here's a bunch of tools. How many problems can we solve with these tools? What are we left with? So I'm just curious to hear like people's thoughts, responses, how this is tracking or failing to track things that folks are interested in. General impressions, yeah.
Seems to me a lot of the problem of sexism is affecting, but also because as far as you know, saying like they would check that or even like if you're suggesting things and watching Netflix whereas $6 you want seems like
Yeah, and it seems like part of what's going on here maybe is that like we have different levels of decision-making mechanism in our brain, some of which are like more explicit or intentional or reflective than others. And some of these devices are like pulling on pieces of us that are kind of sub-rational in some sense. Like the Netflix, like, do you want to keep watching things tend to pop up not at the end of a show when you've got closure, but like 3 minutes into the new show, just as you're getting hooked. And so like that becomes a way to like pull people back in, like, oh yes, I do want to stick around. And now you're like, well, I said I did, so now I'm still on the hook. So yeah, there's definitely some questions about, and I would even go broader than addiction, but manipulation, right? Finding ways to like pull people's psychological and emotional strings that are to the benefit of the company and not to the benefit of the user. That seems right. And I think one of the really interesting things about this case is the strings that they're pulling on are strings we might also rather not have. So it's like, I kept saying, like, as I was putting this together, that it feels like as I was trying to come up with a title, I was like, is it like the worm on the hook? I'm like, no, it's the poison worm on the hook. Like, we know that it's bad to hurl gendered abuse and frustration, but this is like set up to activate those responses. So in some sense, it's like appealing to our worst impulses as the means of manipulation. I don't know, that feels to me like insult to injury. Like, yes, it's manipulation, but also it's not manipulation by like our kind side or even our like storytelling side. It's like, don't you want to be a little bit more of a sexist jerk? And it's like, no, but so that might be a kind of interesting like way of casting the wrong, is not just the manipulation story, which is not, if it's causal, it's not causal in the way that people have been saying, like, oh, it's going to make people more sexist or something, but like this extra insulting variety of using something that, on the assumption that most people don't want to be sexist, that it's like making it worse, or using that thing's already there. No, go ahead.
How does that play into the accusations that Facebook is
Right. Some of the radicalization stuff. So that gets a little bit interestingly complicated. One story that gets told is, and to be clear, I think it's a multi-factor causal mess. Facebook didn't necessarily want people to be radicalized. It wanted people to keep clicking and engaging, and it turns out the things that keep us clicking and engaging are the more extreme stuff. So it's like a weird side effect rather than an intended harm. But nevertheless, the fact that they recognized it was going on and kept doing it seems not be great, ethically speaking. Like, and the more we get whistleblowers and things, the more it looks like they knew that was a thing. It's also going to be extra complicated because there's this weird feedback loop between some things that are going on social media and some things that are not part of social media, but nevertheless like intersect with it. So again, it's a weird, complicated mess, but I think, yeah, so that's kind of the radicalization story as I understand it, is to the extent it's less that like Facebook has a other research project I'm working on. It turns out old people are especially vulnerable to this polarization and manipulation. It's not that Facebook wanted to radicalize grandma, but like if that makes them money, they're happy to go with it. So that's where kind of the interesting questions I think start to come up about like how we understand responsibility, because a lot of what's going on that I think is kind of fascinating is when people are being manipulated in these ways, they're doing so by doing stuff they already know is wrong. Like, I don't think it's news that calling Siri a bitch is not good practice. But they're doing so in a way that's like, well, it's not really a person. They're not going to complain. Nobody else is going to hear you. Like setting up these kinds of excusing conditions. And you might wonder if there's something similar going on with social media, where like a lot of folks are sharing stuff that they know isn't right. Like, the same folks who are like, oh, don't believe anything you read online, are suddenly like actively sharing a whole bunch of stuff where you're like, I'm pretty sure that's not how this works. What happened to check your sources? So there's this funny sense in which like it's taking people's worst tendencies and manipulating them. I'm still thinking about that, I think, is the short answer, but I think that's a really interesting line to pursue. I wonder if it makes the manipulation more effective. Like, it makes people feel guilty for having gone along, so they double down in defensiveness, which would be an interesting kind of like twist, is if that makes the manipulation more effective. And it doesn't let like grandma off the hook either, or whoever's sort of going along for it, but it makes it harder to dislodge because they're already feeling like, in some sense, you already know. And this to me is one reason I think the lead language is really helpful, because it's not like, oh, here's this new set of, I don't know, pick your favorite pejorative, social justice norms or whatever. It's like, we know you shouldn't use slurs, we know you shouldn't like yell at things, but we're going to set things up so it's really tempting to do, and now you feel guilty for having kind of gone along with it. Which again is a like interesting flip of the causal story. So yeah, I think it's super interesting. Yeah.
if you look at all like the opposite side where like with the time, two different spots, like studying it and ask her like pretty deep intelligent questions. But benefits to that side of it versus just like
Yeah. So I really like the polite use of Alexa. That not everybody is with me on this. Some people really think there's something special about like only showing honor and respect to quote unquote real people. I'm like, I think it's actually kind of cool. I'm on board with the Shinju style, like to the extent that we can practice friendliness and cooperation and you know, interpersonal skills. Cool. And I also worry that there's a little bit of a tendency to act like the interesting, you know, maybe you're starting to see how this ties in with the other project I threatened, the appearance reality thing. Like people are like, oh, it's just appearances, so it doesn't matter. And I'm like, no, I think the appearances matter. And it can be good to have this kind of like friendly, respectful, interactive relationship. And I would love it if people could design Alexis to pull that out without the manipulative edge. But it might, and I'm not honestly sure what the solution is going to look like. Maybe it's making a gender, like play around with that design research, but find ways to build virtual assistants that don't activate gender schemas, because gender is already such a mess that we can't fix it, or at least not at that level. Fixing it would be a different kind of thing. Or maybe we do join in and try to fix, and we're like, look, gender schemas are screwed up. Let's make really, you know, helpful, engaging, but masculine devices for the subservient roles. Interesting side note, one of the early uses of vocal assistance was for the like Garmin type like driving navigation stuff. And they started off with some feminized voices and pulled those off the market real quick because people were complaining they didn't like taking orders from a woman. So I'm like, maybe we should have leaned into that. Maybe that was a missed opportunity. Like, how do we play? So that's kind of where I'm wrestling with this, is like, what do we do if this diagnosis is correct? And maybe part of the value is just like dissecting it so we can see how the system works and then start thinking about like, do we want to build gender-free robots? Do we want to play around with gender? Something I haven't talked about as much here, but I think is actually super important, is not only are all these home devices stereotyped as feminine, but it's a very white kind of femininity. Like, how does that play in? What do we want to think about the ways that race is or is not encoded in various person-like systems? And how do we think about responsibility around that? And I think that puts us all like in the discussion, in the middle of already ongoing discussions about our cultural grammar and our cultural norms, and whether we're happy with our current cultural norms, and whether we have conflicting cultural norms or conflicting tendencies to do better or worse things that might be manipulated or might be exploited. And especially, I'm attracted to the view that says, like, ideally we want to have good relationships with these person-like entities in our environment. What does that look like, and how do we design to bring that about? Where I think these have gone wrong is a bunch of designers have confused easy and profitable with good, and those might not be the same. And in order to think about good relationships, we might need to ask hard questions about lots of features of our cultural environment and the ways that making something person-like makes it really easy to tap into all these other factors of personhood that come with baggage of a variety of different kinds. So good/bad news, doing technology is already doing ethics. Like, we're always trying to think about how to work with people, and that means we need to think about what works for people, and that means we need to think about people and what counts as working, and that we're doing ethics again. I have been talking for a while now, and you all have pizza, so I should not keep you from that any longer. But thank you all. This was a lot of fun for me, and I think, you know, great questions and discussion, and this is helpful. I owe some revisions on a version of this next month, so I was like, maybe I can talk about this and get some thoughts. So we'll see what this might see print one of these days. But I've been having more fun with it than we should have with our work. So thank you all for sharing that with me.